And Turkan Khatun knows what it is because she has watched this same scene play out with the other wives, with the daughters, with the noble women who thought their status would protect them. She was wrong about many things. She was wrong about the strength of her husband's armies. She was wrong about the walls of Bukhara being unbreachable. She was wrong about the Mongols being simple barbarians who could be bought off or reasoned with. But she is not wrong about what happens next. The circle of warriors parts. A single man approaches. He is not larger than the others. He does not wear more elaborate armor. But every warrior around her has positioned himself in relation to this man, their bodies oriented toward him like iron filings near a lodestone. This is not random. This is not spontaneous. This is the culmination of a system that has been refined across thousands of miles and hundreds of cities. A system designed not just to conquer territory, but to absolutely annihilate any possibility of future resistance. She does not yet know that what they are about to do to her has a name in Mongol military doctrine. She does not know that her fate has been discussed and decided by commanders who view this as essential to empire building rather than as cruelty. She does not know that the Mongols keep detailed records of these procedures, that they have refined them based on what produces the most effective psychological impact on surviving populations. What she does know, what her body understands before her mind can fully process it, is that everything she was, everything she represented, every bit of power and status and autonomy she possessed, is about to be systematically erased. And here is what they never taught you in history class about the Mongol conquest. You know about Genghis Khan and his vast empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe. You know about the military tactics, the composite bows, the swift horses, the psychological warfare. You have seen the romanticized versions where Mongol warriors are presented as noble savages or exotic conquerors. But you have never heard about the systematic procedures applied to the wives and daughters of defeated rulers. You have never learned about the deliberate protocols designed to destroy not just armies, but the very concept of resistance. You have never discovered why chroniclers from every culture the Mongols encountered described the same practices with the same horrified language, calling them things that could not be spoken of in polite society. Tonight you will discover what Mongol military doctrine prescribed for the wives of defeated Khans, and why these procedures were considered essential rather than excessive. How the practices were systematized across the entire empire with written protocols that commanders were required to follow. What the Persian, Chinese, Russian, and Arab chroniclers documented, despite their reluctance to describe such things in detail. Why archaeological and genetic evidence confirms the scale and systematic nature of what was done. How survivors who managed to record their experiences described psychological and physical trauma that modern experts recognize immediately. If you want to understand the real history of conquest that empires tried to obscure, subscribe right now. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are listening from, because these stories deserve to reach every corner of the planet. The victims whose suffering was documented in sources from a dozen different cultures deserve to have their experiences acknowledged rather than forgotten. Let us begin with what you thought you knew about Mongol conquest, and then let us systematically dismantle those comfortable myths with evidence that has existed for 8 centuries, but has been carefully sanitized from popular understanding. The romantic narrative that dominates modern perception tells us that the Mongols were brilliant military strategists who conquered through superior tactics and organization. The actual reality that primary sources reveal is that military conquest was only one component of a comprehensive system designed to make resistance psychologically impossible for future generations. The Mongols understood something that most empires discovered only through trial and error. Destroying an army is temporary, but destroying the ability of a culture to imagine resistance is permanent. The scale of Mongol conquest remains difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. From 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes until his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire expanded to cover 12 million square miles. By the time his grandsons finished the conquests, the empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Southeast Asia. This was not gradual expansion over centuries. This was explosive conquest in a single generation that required subduing hundreds of kingdoms, defeating millions of soldiers, and controlling populations that vastly outnumbered the Mongol warriors themselves. The strategic problem the Mongols faced was unprecedented in history. They were a nomadic people numbering perhaps 1 million total, including women and children and elderly. They were attempting to control sedentary civilizations, numbering in the tens of millions. Simple military occupation was impossible. They could not leave enough warriors in each conquered city to prevent rebellion. They needed a system that would make rebellion unthinkable, even in cities where Mongol warriors were vastly outnumbered or completely absent. The solution they developed was documented in the Secret History of the Mongols, in Persian chronicles by Juvayni and Rashid al-Din, in Chinese sources, in Russian chronicles, in Arab accounts, in Armenian histories, and in archaeological evidence from mass graves and genetic studies. Every source from every culture describes the same systematic practices. This was not random violence. This was calculated policy. The theoretical framework was remarkably sophisticated. The Mongols understood that power in sedentary societies was legitimized through inheritance and family connections. A defeated Khan's son could theoretically rally resistance by claiming his father's authority. A defeated Khan's brother could do the same, but a defeated Khan's wife presented a different opportunity. By systematically violating the wives and daughters of defeated rulers in very public and very specific ways, the Mongols accomplished multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. First, they destroyed the legitimacy of any children born afterward. In cultures where bloodline and purity were essential to claims of authority, uncertainty about paternity eliminated the possibility of legitimate succession. Second, they created survivors who would spread accounts of what happened, serving as deterrents to other rulers considering resistance. Third, they generated genetic mixing that would make future attempts at ethnic nationalism more complicated. Fourth, they demonstrated absolute power over the most protected members of enemy societies, showing that no one was beyond Mongol reach. The economic framework that enabled this system reveals its calculated nature. The Mongol military machine was not funded primarily through taxation but through conquest. Each successful campaign had to generate enough wealth to fund the next campaign, while also enriching the warriors enough to keep them loyal. The wives and daughters of defeated rulers represented significant economic value. They could be distributed to warriors as rewards, increasing loyalty without depleting treasury funds. They could be traded or sold. They could be used to create marriage alliances that bound defeated populations to Mongol authority. Their treatment was not emotional or spontaneous, but economically rational within the logic of conquest. The legal framework made these practices mandatory rather than optional. Mongol law, the Yasa, included specific provisions about the treatment of defeated enemies. These were not suggestions. These were commands carrying the death penalty for disobedience. Genghis Khan personally issued orders about how conquered populations should be handled, and later Khans continued and refined these protocols. We have these orders preserved in multiple sources because they were treated as fundamental law rather than as informal customs. The documentary evidence is extensive despite 8 centuries of attempted erasure. The Secret History of the Mongols, written in 1240 but describing events from Genghis Khan's lifetime, contains passages that translators have struggled with for generations because the practices described seem too calculated and systematic to be believable. Persian historian Ata Malik Juvayni, who worked for the Mongols and had access to their administrative records, documented practices in his History of the World Conqueror, written in 1260. His account is remarkably detailed because he was trying to explain to future generations why the Mongols were so effective at preventing rebellion. Chinese sources are equally explicit. The Yuanxi, the official history of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, contains administrative records showing that these practices were not isolated incidents but implemented across hundreds of cities. Russian chronicles from the 13th century describe the same patterns when Mongols conquered Rus principalities. Arab historians like Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 1220s and 30s, documented what happened in Central Asian and Middle Eastern cities. Armenian chroniclers recorded similar events. Every culture conquered by the Mongols produced sources describing the same systematic treatment of noble women. Recent scholarship has started to examine these sources more honestly, rather than dismissing them as exaggerations. Archaeological evidence from mass graves shows demographic patterns consistent with chroniclers' accounts. Genetic studies reveal patterns of Y chromosome distribution that match what historical sources describe, with Mongol genetic markers appearing suddenly and broadly across Eurasia. Modern historians using trauma-informed approaches to analyze primary sources recognize that the consistency across cultures and time periods indicates systematic policy rather than random violence. The Mongol systems solve the fundamental problem of conquering vast territories with limited forces through a comprehensive approach that combined military superiority with psychological warfare, with genetic disruption, with economic incentives. The treatment of defeated rulers' wives was not a side effect of conquest. It was central to the strategic vision that allowed a relatively small, nomadic population to control the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Understanding this context is essential before we examine individual cases, because it helps us recognize that what happened to specific women was not personal, it was not emotional, it was not spontaneous. It was the implementation of deliberately designed protocols intended to achieve specific strategic objectives. The horror lies not in chaos, but in calculation, not in passion, but in planning, not in individual cruelty, but in systematic policy refined through experience across hundreds of conquests. Now, let us examine what those protocols looked like when applied to specific women whose names and stories survived in the historical record. We return to Turkan Khatun outside Bukhara in the spring of 1220, age 28. Wife of Sultan Muhammad II, who ruled the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in Central Asia before the Mongols arrived. Her crime, if we can call it that, was being married to a man who made the catastrophic mistake of killing Mongol ambassadors and trade envoys, an act that Genghis Khan used as justification for the complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. The claiming ritual that Turkan Khatun was about to experience followed a pattern documented in sources from across the Mongol Empire. This was not improvised. This was protocol. Understanding each stage reveals the systematic nature of what was done. Stage 1 began 3 days earlier when Bukhara fell after brief resistance. The Mongol commander, following standing orders, had sorted the survivors into categories. Men of fighting age were separated and would be executed or pressed into service as expendable troops for the next siege. Craftsmen with valuable skills were identified and would be transported to Mongolia or to other parts of the empire where their expertise was needed. Religious scholars and administrators who could help govern the conquered territory were spared. Common women and children were evaluated for their potential use. Noble women were treated differently. They were immediately identified through their clothing, their jewelry, their inability to perform manual labor. Turkan Khatun was recognized specifically as the Sultan's wife, because several captured officials were forced to identify her under threat of death. She was then held separately from the other prisoners in a tent guarded by senior warriors. She was not harmed during these 3 days. She was given adequate food and water. This was deliberate. The Mongols wanted her healthy and visibly unharmed for what came next. During those 3 days, messengers were sent to inform Genghis Khan that the Sultan's wife had been captured. Genghis Khan sent back specific instructions about how she should be handled. These instructions were preserved in Persian chronicles, because they became model protocols used in subsequent conquests. The wife of a ruler who resisted Mongol authority was to undergo a public claiming ritual designed to demonstrate the absolute nature of Mongol victory and to create witnesses who would spread accounts to other cities, considering resistance. On the third day, Turkan Khatun was brought to the location outside the city where the ritual would occur. The site was selected deliberately. It was visible from the city walls, so survivors could witness. It was on open ground with no shelter or obstacles. The circle of warriors was arranged in a specific formation that Persian sources describe in detail because later commanders needed to know how to replicate it. The circle served multiple purposes. It prevented escape or rescue. It created a defined space that focused attention. It allowed all the warriors present to serve as witnesses, which was important because Mongol military culture valued eyewitness accounts as legal evidence. Most importantly, it transformed what happened from a private act into a public ceremony with political meaning. When the Mongol commander approached Turkan Khatun, he spoke words that were part of the formal protocol. Multiple sources record the same phrasing in different languages, suggesting this was standardized language translated into whatever local language the victim would understand. The commander stated that her previous marriage was nullified because her husband was an enemy of the Great Khan. He stated that she now belonged to the Mongol people, and specifically to him as the conqueror of her city. He stated that her acceptance of this was mandatory, and that resistance would result in death not for her, but for other prisoners, who would be brought and executed in front of her until she complied. This last point was crucial to the psychological impact. The Mongols had learned through experience that threatening the victim herself was less effective than threatening innocents, whose deaths she could prevent through compliance. Turkan Khatun was presented with a choice that was not a choice. Submit willingly to what was going to happen regardless, or watch other people die because of her resistance. Every chronicler who describes these rituals notes